Welcome back to the State of the Line podcast. I'm your host, Christine Pike. NCCI recently hosted our annual Insights Symposium, where the industry's most respected thought leaders delivered exclusive workers' compensation insights and analysis. Today, we're having a special episode of the podcast where two of our AIS presenters, Patrick Coate and Paul Hendrick, will be discussing their presentations on demographics in a segment we're calling Experts on Experts. Check back. We're going to be doing a few more of these about special AIS topics. Now, gentlemen, will you please introduce yourselves for our audience?
Hi, my name is Patrick Coate, Senior Economist, and this year at AIS, I led the session Demographic Forces Shaping Workplace Risk.
And I'm Paul Hendrick, Practice Leader and Senior Actuary. This year, I presented From Demographics to Claims, Turning Data into Insights. That's right. We had not one, but two separate demographic sessions this year at AIS. Now, Patrick, why do you think that is?
Changing workforce continues to be top of mind for industry stakeholders, and demographics are important to understanding what we're seeing, both in labor force and claims data. So to give the audience the full picture of what we're seeing, both on inside and outside data, it made sense to split the content into two sessions.
I love it. So you kicked us off by examining how population shifts, aging demographics, migration patterns, and all those related trends influence labor force changes and overall injury patterns. Now, I think the population shifts are the important place for us to start, because that really sets the stage for the rest of your presentation. What are we seeing there?
Yeah, simply we're seeing U.S. population growth is fairly slow, and that constrains labor force growth.
What do you mean when you say slow? And what would be causing it to be slow?
Growth is less than 1% annually. It has been below or around that for a long time, at least 20 years. And as far as causes, a big reason is natural growth is slowing down, meaning how many people are born versus pass away each year in the U.S. So the growth that we are still seeing in the last decade, especially in the last few years, is mostly coming from immigration. And this is a trend we expect to continue. In fact, most projections expect deaths to outnumber births in the U.S. within just 5 years.
And I have to imagine that the growth that we're seeing varies by state, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The fastest growing states in the U.S. are mostly either in the South or like the Mountain West region. So Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, as well as Idaho, Utah, and other states in that region. A lot of Midwest or Northeastern states are growing just a little bit or not at all. And there are some charts and exhibits about this within my presentation, which you can access, by the way, on ncci.com, along with the full video of both of our talks. That can illustrate the change for you, but we're definitely seeing growth concentrated in certain regions.
Okay. And are those state differences coming mostly from differences in natural change or from the immigration that you talked about?
That's a good question. And the short answer is mostly neither. So all states and regions gain some population from new immigrants, and most gain a little bit from natural change too. Although in some regions, births and deaths are almost equal right now. But the biggest driver of regional growth differences is internal migration, people moving from one part of the U.S. to another. This mostly means on net, people moving south and west, which has been true not only in the last decade, but for a long time, pretty much since the invention of modern AC.
All right, well, there's a lot more we could probably say about that, but let's shift gears a little bit. If the population growth's been around 1% for over 20 years, how does that impact labor force growth?
Yeah, so labor force growth comes from a combination of population growth and labor force participation. And so it's actually been even slower than that overall 1% growth. And that's important to note because it's labor force growth that really drives employment, payroll, and premium, all of which are very important to the workers' compensation industry. So the fact that labor force growth has slowed down means a smaller share of adults are working than were 20 years ago. But what's interesting is if you look at labor force participation by age, it's almost as high now as it's ever been. So it's not really because people aren't as attached to the labor market as they used to be. It's because of aging.
All right, tell me more about aging.
Yeah, so in the last 20 years, a lot of Americans have reached retirement age. This is the big baby boom generation. So from 20 to 10 years ago, as a lot of people approached retirement age and labor participation among younger people was a little depressed coming out of the Great Recession, more than 100% of total labor force growth was coming from workers 55 and above. In the last 10 years, there has been continued growth in the older workforce. We've seen a continued big increase in the number of Americans over the age of 65. And while more than 80% of those people are retired, some are staying in the labor market. But the big cohort of millennials, along with recovering participation rates as labor demands pulled a lot more people into the workforce, means that the largest contributor to labor force growth in the last decade has been early to mid-career workers. And that's a big shift. So the aging workforce is still part of the story, but it's not the whole story anymore, at least not for a while till millennials like us become the new older workers. So age alone isn't the whole story, and we do talk about some other things impacting the labor force, as well as talking about some external injury statistics by age in my presentation. So if those interested in learning more, definitely check that out. But Paul, I think this is a good time to shift gears. So I know the aging workforce plays a big part in your presentation as well.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So sure, let's pivot and talk about how those demographic shifts may or may not be impacting workers' compensation directly using the NCCI data. And I'll start by throwing out just some basic facts here. Like 55 and up workers, they make up about a quarter of the labor force. But if you look at the lost time claims, it's up to 28%. You look at losses, it's up to 34%. And so what that tells us is that workers over 55 have a higher frequency of injury, higher severity of injury than other workers. And in fact, that comes out to experiencing claim frequency about 1/4 higher than other workers, and claim severities that are about 1/3 higher than other workers.
That's a bigger differential than I would have guessed.
Me too, actually. And it highlights the exposure that older workers present. And that exposure is growing too, like you just said. Older workers make up an increasing proportion of the lost time claim mix, just like they do the labor force. And also, let me clarify a little bit what I mean when I say older workers from this perspective. The growth in exposure in workers' compensation actually comes from workers beyond the traditional retirement age of 65.
What do you suppose might be driving that?
Well, 2 words, Patrick, to summarize what you already said: baby boomers. As you've already mentioned, more and more baby boomers have reached that traditional retirement age, but they haven't necessarily retired. And there's a couple of factors that go into that. Improvements in medicine and lifespan, lack of savings among people near retirement, and even just the desire for human connection at work, just to name a few.
Okay, so overall, we know older workers are experiencing both higher claim frequency and higher claim severity. What does that look like by cause of injury?
Well, it's no surprise that workers over 65 have a different risk profile than other employees. A smaller share of their claims come from those kind of exertion or contact injuries you might expect, like strains or crushing or being hit by an object. But where we really see older workers have a higher exposure is in the rate of slip and fall claims. Nearly half of all 65 and up claim costs actually come from falls, which is far higher than other age groups.
Why do you think that is?
So first, it seems like employers and loss prevention staff, they are mitigating the obvious workplace risks that workers over 65 face, lifting heavy objects or climbing ladders. And in fact, what we're seeing is that slip and fall claims are not actually caused by higher fall risk in those typically hazardous situations. Instead, falls from older workers are disproportionately happening on flat surfaces, or otherwise without any aggravating factors.
That's interesting. It goes back to the different risk profile you mentioned. So employers could be working to prevent injury in older workers, by not assigning heavy lifting, but they may not be thinking about things like a minor fall hazard, which aren't traditionally major risks for younger workers, but may be negatively impacting older folks.
Yeah, exactly. And that's especially true as we think about the workforce continuing to age, which it will, right?
Yes. In fact, when we look at projected change for the labor force for roughly the next decade, all growth is likely coming from either that 65 plus age range or workers ages about 45 to 55. We'll actually have fewer workers in the first and last 10 years of their careers than we do right now.
And that's also important for claims because new hires are a frequency driver. New hires represent a little over 20% of the workforce. They generate twice that, about 40% of lost time claims in the work comp system. So where the workforce is growing, matters a lot. Now, it is worth noting, though, that the share of new hire claims has been declining since 2022. And there is some economic tie-in there as well. So will that trend continue? I have my own answer, but Patrick, you're the economist, so why don't you tell me what you think?
Oh, as an economist, I think I have to say maybe. It depends.
Okay. Well, I hope so, because that's my answer too. Economic uncertainty, there's potential disruptions from AI, slowdown in population growth. Those all pose interesting questions about the future of the workforce.
Okay, so let's say we do see this lower level of new hires continuing. What could that look like?
Well, you could potentially see some lower frequency and also a different claim mix for insurers to consider. You think about newer workers, they're higher frequency in terms of claims, but they're more prone to injuries like contusions or lacerations, which are relatively minor injuries, while the more experienced workers are less likely to suffer from those types of injuries.
Yeah, I think we could keep looking into more little demographic stuff all day.
Yeah, maybe we'll make this podcast episode a two-parter like our sessions at AIS.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll let the listeners tell us if they want to hear more. Again, all our presentation materials from AIS are available at ncci.com and will be linked in the show notes for today's episode as well. If you do have any questions or want to discuss anything further with us, please don't hesitate to reach out at insights@ncci.com.
This podcast is the copyrighted material of the National Council on Compensation Insurance, 2026. All rights reserved.